There shouldn't be anything more devastating to a scientific theory than false predictions. Please then consider the following graph from Dr. Roy Spencer from the University of Alabama, Huntsville. According to Dr. Spencer, the climate models that governments base policy decisions on have failed miserably. His graph compares the predictions of 90 climate computer models versus observations for global average surface temperature through 2013. He found that more than 95% of the models have overforecast the warming trend since 1979, whether we use their own surface temperature dataset or the satellite dataset of lower tropospheric temperatures. But the models didn't just overforecast the warming trend since 1979. They utterly failed to predict the 18-year pause in global warming since 1998, which only just may have stopped. While CO2 levels steadily increased, and with the models predicting global temperature to rise in lockstep with CO2, the global temperature trend flatlined and maybe even decreased slightly for a period of 18 years. This is a real embarrassment which the climate science establishment will not admit publicly, but thanks to the ClimateGate emails we do know that they admit it privately. Here is a quote from IPCC insider Kevin Trenberth. "The fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it is a travesty that we can't. We are tempted at this point to rest our case, but there is even more devastating scientific evidence to consider. It is time to put CO2 in perspective. First off, it is not a noxious pollutant, but an odorless and colorless gas that is essential for life on Earth. Plants need CO2 to live. You and I exhale CO2 when we breathe. There is nothing unnatural about it. That CO2 now stands convicted of being the primary driver of dangerous global warming suggests that it is prominent in the atmosphere. The truth, however, is quite the opposite. CO2 is a trace gas in the atmosphere, constituting only about 0.04%, or 400 parts per million. To put this in perspective, in round numbers, the atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, adding up to 99% between the two. The remaining 1% is comprised of various trace gases. CO2 only contributes 4% of that 1%. But what then could account for it playing such a dominant role in the warming of the climate system? Surely it must be a very potent greenhouse gas. The truth, however, is that it is a relatively weak greenhouse gas. It trails water vapor, the most abundant greenhouse gas, in its inherent ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. Methane, although less abundant, also has much stronger greenhouse properties than CO2. But despite these facts, the IPCC claims that CO2 is much more than a bit player. They claim that this natural, odorless, colorless, and essential trace gas in the atmosphere with third-rate greenhouse properties is the primary driver of the warming since 1750. Let's begin working through and rebutting their chain of evidence and reasoning, which leads them to their grand conclusion that we must drastically cut our CO2 emissions. Why must we cut human CO2 emissions from the burning of fossil fuels? Because human CO2 emissions are the primary cause of dangerous global warming. How do we know that? Because the Earth is warming unusually. Rising CO2 is the primary cause of this unusual warming. Human CO2 emissions from the burning of fossil fuels in turn are the primary cause of rising CO2, and computer models say the warming caused by human CO2 emissions will be dangerous. We are going to attack all four of these elements of the global warming hypothesis, and remember, if we show that any one of them hasn't been established by a preponderance of the evidence, the entire case against CO2 collapses. The IPCC claims that we know that the Earth is warming unusually because, first, the Earth is warming since the 19th century. We know this from the surface temperature and other records. We admit this and would even agree, along with the IPCC, that this warming is unequivocal. Second, changes in the cryosphere, oceans, and other real-world phenomena confirm this warming. We admit there are changes consistent with some warming. And third, this warming, however detected, is unprecedented or unusual. This we deny. In order to argue that this warming is unusual relative to the warming in the past, the IPCC needs an accurate record of modern global temperatures. Primary among the multiple lines of evidence for this unprecedented warming cited by the IPCC is the surface temperature record. But we will show that this foundational evidence is spurious and unreliable. This is true because of the evident bias of those responsible for the major surface temperature records, the substantial evidence of tampering with the major surface temperature records, the lack of transparency and reproducibility of such records, contamination caused by poor siting of temperature stations in the U.S., the urban heat island effect, and poor geographic coverage of measuring stations, the growing divergence between the surface temperature records and measurements from satellites and balloons, and finally, the contradictions between the modern surface temperature record and historical evidence. Here is how the IPCC, using 4 different data sets, depicts the 150-year history of global temperature. It shows a definite warming trend from 1850 unto the present. How can we question 4 different data sets which have been given the imprimatur of the IPCC? Well, first off, consider that it is the same IPCC offering this evidence which we thoroughly discredited earlier. Enough said. Second, 3 of the 4 data sets come from sources infamous for their biases and partisanship. Recall our friend Phil Jones of ClimateGate infamy. Professor Jones was heavily involved in the development of the CRUTEM-3 dataset favored by the IPCC. The NCDC dataset comes from the National Climate Data Center, now known as NOAA. Its former director was Tom Carl, an acolyte of Al Gore and prominent member of the climate science establishment. NOAA is heavily involved with the IPCC. The GISS dataset comes from NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, a hotbed of climate activism. Here we get to properly meet Dr. James Hansen, now retired. We encountered him briefly in our first segment as the activist scientist who likes to get arrested protesting coal and hanging out with Daryl Hannah. Hansen was head of the Goddard Institute of Space Studies when he skyrocketed to fame in 1988. Senators Al Gore and Timothy Wirth made him their star witness at a Senate hearing, and Hansen didn't disappoint. With hardly a decade of warming behind him, Hansen boldly made dire predictions of catastrophic global warming fueled by human CO2 emissions. He quickly became a media star and popular author who has compared coal trains to the trains which delivered Holocaust victims to the extermination camps. That the custodians of the surface temperature records have acted in accordance with their bias is beyond dispute. Exhibit A in this regard is their tampering and manipulating the temperature records to suit the desired narrative that the late 20th century warming was unprecedented and correlated with rising CO2. Getting back to the IPCC's temperature history, we see that it shows a definite warming trend from 1850 unto the present. Of great significance is that the present warming greatly exceeds that of the 1930s, the Dust Bowl years in the United States. For those of us who remember stories told by our parents and grandparents with living memories of that time, this strikes us as more than a little incredible. With good reason. After achieving fame under Al Gore's sponsorship, James Hansen undertook the task of adjusting 20th century temperatures. For a good account of Hansen's shenanigans at NASA, see Christopher Horner's book, Red Hot Lies. Essentially, what Hansen and his colleagues did was rewrite the temperature history by lowering the temperatures of the 1930s, thus making the present warming trend seem unprecedented. For example, it used to be commonly held that 1936 was the hottest year of the century, but that didn't fit the narrative, so Hansen and his cronies adjusted past temperatures to make 1998 the warmest year on record. Tony Heller, better known as Steve Goddard at the realclimatescience.com website, has conducted painstaking historical and archival research which exposes the data tampering at NOAA and NASA. Here are some highlights from a very good talk he gave in 2016. This map shows how many cities recorded 100 degrees or more on July 9, 1936. This graph shows that the United States used to have many more 100-degree days back in the 30s, yet we are told that the present has never been hotter. Heller concludes, and here is the smoking gun of fraud. The adjustments being made correlate almost perfectly to the rise in atmospheric CO2. The data is being tampered with to match greenhouse gas warming theory. Across the pond, Phil Jones was also tampering with his data sets, something which he was understandably unwilling to allow to be known. Recall that Jones fought tooth and nail to prevent access to his data. In refusing to divulge his data to Warwick Hughes, Jones said, "Even if WMO agrees, I will still not pass on the data. We have 25 or so years invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" The ClimateGate emails also reveal that Jones conspired to thwart Freedom of Information Act requests and was even willing to destroy his data lest they get in the hands of his critics. Oh well, why do we need transparency in climate science? Another example of blatant data fudging is the so-called Pausebuster paper released in 2015 by NOAA, just in time for the Paris climate talks. The Carl et al. Paper contradicted every data set at the time, which showed an 18-year-long pause in the warming. They erased the pause in part by tampering with sea surface temperature data. Specifically, they took temperature readings from ships, which are known to run hot, and mixed them with better measurements from buoys. An article by David Rose at the Daily Mail exposed the scandal with the help of NOAA whistleblower John Bates. Consider also the fact that one of the hallmarks of good science is its reproducibility. When looking at the IPCC temperature graph, the layman is given the impression that underlying the curves are hard data. The truth is quite the opposite. To be sure, the CRU and NASA begin with the raw data, but then this raw data undergoes a lot of manipulation, much of which is poorly documented. In the case of the CRU, this was dramatically exposed in the famous Harry README file from the ClimateGate emails. Harry refers to Ian Harry Harris, a junior researcher at the CRU. He was asked by Phil Jones to bring all the computer code up to date, which proved to be an impossible task because the original programmer no longer worked at the CRU. Harris documented his frustrations with the poor quality of the computer code and underlying database in a file titled Harry README. The reasons for his frustrations are apparent from the following excerpts. Getting seriously fed up with the state of the Australian data. So many new stations have been introduced, so many false references, so many changes that aren't documented. We don't know the coefficient files, but what are all those monthly files? Don't know, undocumented. Wherever I look, there are data files, no info about what they are other than their names, and that's useless. And on and on. No wonder Phil Jones didn't want Warwick Hughes to see CRU's data. We will let meteorologists Joe DeLeo and Anthony Watts weigh in on the integrity of the surface temperature record. Instrumental temperature data for the pre-satellite era, 1850 to 1980, have been so widely, systematically, and unidirectionally tampered with that it cannot be credibly asserted there has been any significant global warming in the 20th century. But there are even more reasons not to trust the surface temperature record. Anthony Watts is a California meteorologist who maintains the popular What's Up With That website. More than anyone, Watts has been responsible for showing that the U.S. temperature network, considered to be the best in the world, is corrupt and unreliable. In 2007, Watts, with the help of citizen auditors around the country, exposed the poor siting of U.S. temperature stations. For example, the auditors documented that the temperature readings were being artificially warmed because measurement devices were placed next to barbecue grills, in heat islands of asphalt, next to air conditioner units, and so on. Watts concluded that 9 out of 10 stations were likely reporting higher than actual temperatures because of poor siting. Watts states, "It gets worse. We observed that changes in the technology of temperature stations over time also has caused them to report a false warming trend. We found major gaps in the data record that were filled in with data from nearby sites, a practice that propagates and compounds errors. We found that adjustments to the data by both NOAA and another government agency, NASA, caused recent temperatures to look even higher." From this he concludes, "The conclusion is inescapable. The U.S. temperature record is unreliable. The errors in the record exceed by a wide margin the purported rise in temperature of 0.7 degrees C during the 20th century. Consequently, this record should not be cited as evidence of any trend in temperature that may have occurred across the U.S. during the past century. Since the U.S. record is thought to be the best in the world, it follows that the global database is likely similarly compromised and unreliable. This caused a real scandal, and officials at the National Climatic Data Center under Dr. Tom Karl did not take kindly to this expose. However, eventually the center grudgingly started to cooperate with reforms so its measurements could regain some integrity. However, there remain many other corrupting factors, and given the agency's track record, one is reasonable to assume there is still warming bias built into the thermometer record. Besides absurd station placements, there is the problem of discontinuity in the measuring stations. Ross McKittrick has charted a dramatic worldwide closure of more than one-half of the planet's surface stations during 1989 to 1991. Most of the closures affected cold weather latitude stations in Canada and Siberia. McKittrick shows that the abrupt shift upward in measured global temperature coincides with the drop in operating surface stations. There is also serious doubt whether NASA and the CRU have adequately adjusted for the urban heat island effect. In a 2004 study, Michaels and McKittrick tested the IPCC's claim that adjustments to surface temperature records have removed urban heat island contamination. They report, "We looked at how the pattern of warming over the Earth's land surface compared to local economic conditions. As expected, we found statistically significant correlations between weather station data and socioeconomic data. We also found statistically significant correlations remained in the adjusted climate data. In other words, the adjustment models were not removing the contamination patterns as claimed. If the contamination were removed, we estimated the average measured warming rate over land after 1980 would decline by about half." Dutch meteorologists Joos de Laat and Achilles Morales also studied this problem. They used different data and a different testing methodology, but came to identical conclusions. Recall the divergence problem plaguing paleoclimate science. While the surface temperature record for the late 20th century goes up, proxy temperature measurements from tree rings go down. Well, the keepers of the surface temperature records face a similar embarrassment. There is a growing divergence between the surface temperature records and independent measurements from satellites and balloons. Given the evidence of the contamination of the surface temperature records, the lack of transparency and other misconduct of the keepers of those records, not to mention their one-sided data manipulation, deviation from well-accepted climate history, and obvious partisanship, we conclude that the surface temperature record is unreliable and that the temperature history offered by the IPCC is false. It falsely diminishes the actual warming of the 1930s and exaggerates the warming from the 1980s to the present. But the IPCC ignores these problems and goes on to argue that in the Northern Hemisphere, 1983 to 2012 was likely the warmest 30-year period of the last 1,400 years. But even if our thermometer records were trustworthy, we still couldn't trust the temperature reconstructions coming from the paleoclimate community, given the sordid history of the hockey stick affair. The IPCC needs to acknowledge that there was a medieval warm period, which was as warm or warmer than today, and that we are now just emerging from the subsequent Little Ice Age. But what about melting ice? rising sea levels, and other circumstantial evidence of warming, don't they prove there is something highly unusual going on? Actually not. The models predict that the cryosphere will be sensitive to global warming, and there isn't a day that passes, it seems, in which alarming announcements about the melting polar ice caps aren't trumpeted. And recall the dire picture painted by the IPCC in their very professional video.
The effects of global warming are most evident in some of the coldest places on the planet. Ice sheets and glaciers worldwide are losing mass, permafrost is thawing, and the snow and sea ice cover in the Arctic is decreasing.
But what is the truth of the matter? We now offer testimony from another geologist, Ian Plimer, to put this in perspective. Planet Earth has been a warm, wet greenhouse volcanic planet for 80% of time. There have been numerous ice ages in which there are fluctuating greenhouse and icehouse conditions. Since the end of the last glaciation 14,000 years ago, ice sheets have largely melted and created a 130-meter sea level rise. During previous glaciations and interglacials, ice sheets expanded and contracted due to changes in temperature, humidity, slope, snowfall, landslides, solar radiation, and ice evaporation. Many changes to ice sheets are due to local features. Temperature was warmer and sea level was higher during past interglacials. At present, some ice sheets are advancing, others are retreating, and others are static. There is neither a significant loss nor gain to polar ice, alpine valley glaciers, and sea ice. Drill holes in Antarctic and Greenland ice are a window into the past. During previous interglacials, when it was far warmer than now, the ice sheets did not completely melt. In Antarctica, ice sheets and sea ice are expanding. There is a millennial-scale polar seesaw. When Antarctica is cooling, the Arctic is warming and vice versa. The Arctic was warmer than now between 1920 and 1940. But what about rising sea levels? Isn't this evidence of a dangerously warming planet? You may recall that Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, hyped sea level rise as one of the dangerous consequences of global warming. Here is a clip showing his computer-generated scenarios.
If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida. This is what would happen to San Francisco Bay. A lot of people live in these areas. The Netherlands, one of the low countries. Absolutely devastating.
While the IPCC doesn't paint such a bleak future, their portrayal of current and future sea level rise is equally false. We will let Professor Nils Axel Morner, the world's leading expert on the subject, speak. In short, Dr. Morner thinks that Al Gore's computer-generated nightmare scenarios and the IPCC computer projections which inform them are bunk. The considered opinion of real sea level experts is that sea levels will rise about a total of 10 centimeters in the next 100 years, with a range of error of plus or minus 10 centimeters. So, if you like, at its worst, a total of 20 centimeters. That's about 8 inches in 100 years. That the IPCC's dire predictions, and certainly Al Gore's nightmare scenarios, are not credible is reinforced by the following points made by Dr. Morner in this interview. The 2 times he was an expert reviewer for the IPCC in 2000 and 2006, none of the authors of the sea level section were sea level specialists. In order to generate the higher annual rates of sea level rise, the IPCC used tidal gauges in places where the land is sinking, such as Hong Kong. In other words, they use records that any sane researcher would know they shouldn't use. Even more egregious is their falsification of the data. According to Dr. Morner, satellite measurements showed no trend in sea level rise from 1992 to 2002. But, he says, quote, then in 2003, the same data set, which in their publications and their website was a straight line, suddenly it changed and showed a very strong line of uplift, 2.3 millimeters per year, the same as from the tide gauge. And that didn't look so nice. It looked as though they had recorded something, but they hadn't recorded anything. It was the original one, which they had suddenly twisted up because they entered a correction factor, which they took from the tidal gauge. So it was not a measured thing, but a figure introduced from outside. I accused them of this at the Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and they answered that we had to do it because otherwise we would not have gotten any trend. Dr. Morner also personally visited the Maldives, Tuvalu Islands, and other places promoted as victims of global warming and rising sea levels. He found that the reported rise in sea level was either non-existent or due to local conditions. He also learned that a tree in the Maldives, made famous as a symbol of the island's peril, and which was slated for destruction by the rising seas, was removed by Australian climate activists because its continued existence was embarrassing evidence of the falsity of their claims. So we conclude that the cryosphere and sea levels are not behaving unusually. The Earth is dynamic, and it would be out of character were ice and sea levels remaining static. Therefore, with regard to the first element of the prosecution's case, we conclude that the globe has warmed, but the prosecution has failed to prove that there is anything unusual about the warming, either from the temperature record or changes in the cryosphere or sea levels. The warming which we have experienced since the start of the Industrial Revolution is not alarming in any way.